The sound echoed through the frozen silence like a cannon blast. Every man on board looked in the same direction. The sea beneath them had just split apart. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Then another deafening crack rolled across the endless white landscape. The ship trembled. Wood groaned. Ice pressed harder against the hull. One sailor whispered, "She's not going to survive this." No storm was raging. No enemy was attacking. The ocean itself was destroying their ship. Thousands of miles from civilization, 28 men stood completely helpless as Antarctica slowly crushed the strongest vessel they had ever trusted. None of them knew it yet. But this was the beginning of a survival story that would inspire the world for generations. Just 11 months earlier, everything had looked very different. The mood was filled with excitement. Families waved goodbye from the docks. The crew believed they were about to make history. Their leader, Sir Ernest Shackleton, wasn't chasing fame. He wanted to accomplish something no human had ever achieved. His mission was to become the first explorer to cross the entire Antarctic continent on foot. It sounded almost impossible. Nearly 3,000 kilometers of glaciers, mountains, blizzards, and temperatures cold enough to freeze exposed skin within minutes. Many experienced explorers warned him not to attempt it. Shackleton listened to every warning. Then he quietly smiled and ordered the expedition to sail south. On board was a specially built wooden ship called Endurance. Its massive oak hull had been designed to survive the crushing force of Antarctic ice. The crew believed there was no safer ship on Earth. They had no idea that Antarctica wasn't interested in human confidence. It played by its own rules. As Endurance pushed deeper into the Southern Ocean, the weather changed almost every day. The waves became colder. The wind grew stronger. Small floating pieces of ice slowly appeared across the water. At first they looked harmless, almost beautiful. The sailors even joked as the ship carefully weaved between them. But every mile south brought more ice. The gaps between the frozen blocks became smaller. The open sea slowly disappeared. Without realizing it, Endurance was sailing into a trap that had already claimed countless ships before her. For the next several days, Endurance kept moving south. Progress became slower with every passing hour. The crew had to steer carefully through narrow channels that twisted between towering walls of ice. Sometimes the passage ahead looked completely blocked, only to open at the last moment. Each successful turn gave the men a little more confidence. Maybe the warnings had been exaggerated. Maybe they really could reach Antarctica before winter closed in. But Antarctica had a way of rewarding overconfidence with silence. Then, on the morning of January 18, 1915, everything changed. The engines were still running, the sails were set, yet the ship refused to move. At first, nobody panicked. The captain ordered more power. The propeller churned violently beneath the water, but Endurance remained exactly where she was. The crew rushed to the rails. Every direction looked the same. Solid white. During the night, shifting pack ice had quietly surrounded the ship from every side, without firing a single shot. The frozen ocean had captured them. Shackleton refused to believe the expedition was over. He ordered the men onto the ice with picks, shovels, and long poles. For hours they hacked at the frozen walls, hopping to free a path wide enough for the ship to escape. The work was exhausting. Every blow echoed across the silent wilderness. Every broken chunk of ice seemed to make no difference at all. Then someone spotted what looked like a miracle. Less than 60 meters away, a long crack had opened through the ice. If they could reach it, Endurance might finally break free. The engines roared at full power. The entire ship shuddered as the crew prayed for even the slightest movement. Minutes passed, then an hour, then another. The propeller never stopped turning, but the ship never moved, not even an inch. That was the moment the crew understood a terrifying truth. They were no longer sailing through Antarctica. Antarctica had taken control of their journey. Shackleton gathered his officers that evening. No one said the words out loud, but every man around that discussion knew the same thing. From this point forward, survival would depend less on the strength of the ship, and more on the strength of the people aboard her. Outside, the temperature continued to fall. The sun stayed lower in the sky each day. And somewhere beyond the endless field of ice, the long Antarctic winter was already on its way. The days blended into weeks, weeks turned into months. Yet every morning, the view outside looked exactly the same, an endless world of white. The engines had fallen silent. Endurance was no longer a ship on a voyage. It had become a prisoner drifting wherever the Antarctic ice decided to carry it. Shackleton quickly realized there was only one choice left. If they couldn't escape before winter, they would have to survive it. The crew transformed the trapped ship into a floating home. Daily routines were carefully planned. Scientists continued recording observations. The carpenter repaired equipment. The cook prepared hot meals whenever fuel allowed. Even simple conversations and games became important. Shackleton understood that in Antarctica, a man's greatest enemy wasn't always the cold. Sometimes it was hopelessness. As the weeks passed, daylight slowly disappeared. Then came the polar winter. For weeks at a time, darkness covered the frozen sea. The temperature plunged far below freezing. Powerful winds swept across the ice, shaking the ship day and night. Outside, the world was silent. Inside, every man waited. Then the sounds began. At first, they were faint. A low creaking noise deep inside the hull. The crew paused, listening. Another groan echoed through the ship. Then another. Each day, the sounds grew louder. The drifting ice around Endurance was constantly moving. Massive slabs collided with one another, creating enormous pressure. That pressure had only one place to go, straight into the wooden hull. The ship had been built to withstand crushing ice. But no ship could resist Antarctica forever. One morning, fresh cracks appeared along the timbers. Doors refused to close properly. Cabin walls shifted ever so slightly. The photographer, Frank Hurley, stepped onto the ice with his camera. Instead of landscapes, he began photographing the ship itself, almost instinctively. He felt history was unfolding before his eyes. Shackleton studied the damage in silence. He didn't allow panic to spread. Not a single order was given in fear. Instead, he calmly instructed every man to prepare for the possibility that they might have to leave the ship without warning. Extra supplies were packed. The 3 lifeboats were checked again. Food was carefully counted. Nobody asked the question they were all thinking, because everyone already knew the answer: if Endurance failed. The nearest civilization was more than 1,000 kilometers away, and between them and safety lay nothing but drifting ice and one of the most unforgiving oceans on Earth. The expedition was no longer a race to cross Antarctica. It had become a race against time, and Antarctica was beginning to win. September 1915, the pressure never stopped. Every day, the frozen sea squeezed Endurance a little tighter. The crew had grown used to the haunting sounds of cracking timber, but now the noises were impossible to ignore. Each groan echoed through the ship like a warning. One morning, Shackleton walked across the deck and noticed something that made him stop. The wooden planks were no longer level. The ship was beginning to twist. Below deck, the walls had shifted. Cabin doors jammed shut. Furniture slid across the floor without anyone touching it. The ice wasn't simply surrounding the ship anymore. It was crushing it. Still, nobody gave up. The crew worked around the clock, unloading supplies onto the ice whenever they had the chance. Food, fuel, medical equipment, navigation instruments, the 3 lifeboats. If the worst happened, those supplies would become the only thing standing between them and death. Then came the moment they had feared for months. Late one afternoon, a deafening crack ripped through the hull. The entire ship lurched violently to one side. Men stumbled across the deck as another explosion echoed from below. "Ice is coming through," someone shouted. The crew rushed below deck. A section of the hull had finally given way. Freezing seawater poured inside faster than anyone expected. Without waiting for orders, the men grabbed the pumps. Hour after hour, they fought to keep the water under control. Hands froze, faces were covered in ice. Every bucket of water they removed was replaced by 2 more. The sea was winning. For nearly 3 days, they refused to stop. No one complained, no one walked away. But exhaustion couldn't change reality. The water kept rising, the pressure outside kept increasing. Shackleton watched his men in silence. He knew what they didn't want to hear. The ship that had carried them halfway across the world could no longer save them. Finally, he gathered the crew on deck. The Antarctic wind cut through the silence. Every face turned toward him. His voice was calm, clear, without a trace of panic. "She's going, boys. Leave the ship." For a few seconds, nobody moved. Some stared at the deck beneath their feet. Others looked toward the endless white horizon. Endurance wasn't just a ship. For nearly a year, it had been their home, their shelter, their only connection to civilization. Now they had to abandon it forever. One by one, the crew stepped onto the ice. No one looked back immediately because deep down, they all knew something. Once they left endurance behind, their real fight for survival would finally begin. The moment the last man stepped off endurance, an uneasy silence settled over the frozen sea. For the first time in nearly a year, the crew had no roof above their heads. Nothing separated them from Antarctica except a few layers of clothing. Shackleton looked back at the ship. It leaned heavily to one side, trapped inside the ice like a wounded animal. He knew there was a chance they would never see it again. But standing there and mourning, the ship would change nothing. Now, every decision had to be about one thing: keeping 28 men alive. The crew carried everything they could salvage onto the ice: boxes of food, fuel, medical supplies, navigation instruments, 3 small lifeboats. Everything had to be moved by hand across a frozen surface that could crack without warning. By nightfall, they had built a small camp a safe distance from the ship. It wasn't much: a few tents, sleeping bags laid directly on the ice, a makeshift kitchen protected from the wind. This would be home, at least for now. The next morning, Shackleton gathered everyone together. There was no room for false hope. They needed to know exactly what they had left. The food was counted, the fuel was measured, every piece of equipment was inspected. The numbers were worrying. Even with strict rationing, their supplies wouldn't last forever. There would be no rescue mission, no passing ships, no way to contact the outside world. From this moment on, the expedition had become completely isolated. Yet something remarkable happened. Instead of allowing fear to spread, Shackleton created a routine. Every man received a daily responsibility. Some hunted seals, others collected ice for drinking water. The carpenter repaired damaged sledges. The cook stretched every meal as far as possible, even in the middle of nowhere. Life followed a schedule. Shackleton understood something many leaders never do: an idle mind creates panic. A busy mind creates hope. Every evening the men gathered together. They shared stories, played cards, laughed whenever they could, not because life was easy, but because giving up was a luxury they couldn't afford. Still, Antarctica wasn't finished testing them. Beneath their camp, the massive ice floe continued drifting north with the ocean currents. The crew slept peacefully, completely unaware that the ground beneath them was slowly carrying them farther away from every chance of reaching the Antarctic coast. And within weeks, even this frozen camp would no longer be safe. Every morning, the camp looked the same, but the world beneath it was constantly moving. The giant ice floe carrying the crew wasn't anchored to anything. It drifted wherever the wind and ocean currents pushed it. At first, the movement seemed harmless. Then Shackleton compared his navigation readings. His expression changed. Instead of drifting toward land, they were being carried farther away from it. Every day they remained on the ice, their chances of survival grew smaller. The crew had 2 choices: stay where they were and hope for a miracle, or risk everything by dragging their lifeboats across the frozen wilderness. Shackleton didn't hesitate. "We move." The order spread through the camp. Within hours, tents were dismantled, supplies were packed, and the 3 lifeboats were loaded onto heavy sledges. Each boat weighed nearly a ton. Moving them across broken ice would test every ounce of strength the crew had left. The first few hundred meters were brutal. The surface wasn't smooth. Towering ridges of ice blocked their path like frozen mountains. Sometimes they had to unload an entire boat, carry the supplies by hand, drag the empty boat over an obstacle, then return for everything they had left behind. Progress was painfully slow. After nearly 3 exhausting hours of work, one sailor turned around to see how far they had come. The answer crushed everyone's spirit. They had traveled barely a single mile. At that pace, reaching land would take months. Months they simply didn't have. Shackleton gathered his officers once again. No frustration, no panic. Just another difficult decision. The march was over for now. The men pitched their tents once again on the drifting ice. It felt like they had walked in circles only to end up exactly where they had started. But Shackleton refused to let disappointment spread. That evening he moved from tent to tent, speaking with every man. He cracked jokes, shared hot drinks, asked about their families. To an outsider it looked ordinary, but his crew understood exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just protecting their bodies, he was protecting their will to survive, because Shackleton knew something the ice could never understand. A broken ship could be replaced, a broken spirit could not still. Antarctica had one final move to make. Far behind the camp, the crew heard a deep, echoing roar. They turned toward the horizon. Endurance, the ship that had carried them across the world's most dangerous ocean, was taking its final breath. The sound rolled across the frozen wilderness long before anyone saw what had happened. It was deep, heavy, almost like a mountain breaking apart. Every man stopped and turned toward the horizon. In the distance, Endurance was no longer standing upright. The ship leaned sharply to one side, trapped inside a prison of ice that refused to let go for a few moments. No one spoke. They simply watched. The pressure that had been building for months had finally become too much. The ice closed in from every direction. The hull twisted. The deck buckled, one by one. The massive wooden beams snapped with terrifying force. It looked less like a ship sinking, and more like the Antarctic itself was tearing it apart. Then came the final collapse. The bow dipped forward. The stern lifted slowly into the air. For a brief moment, Endurance seemed to fight against the weight pulling it down. Then it disappeared. The freezing water swallowed the ship that had carried their dreams across the Southern Ocean. Within minutes, drifting ice covered the place where it had stood. It was as if Endurance had never existed at all. No one cheered, no one cried. The silence said everything. The crew hadn't just lost a ship, they had lost their shelter, their supplies, their safest place in one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. One sailor quietly removed his hat. Another stared at the empty horizon, unable to look away. Shackleton watched until the last piece of wreckage vanished beneath the ice. Only then did he turn back toward his men. His face showed no fear, only determination. "We've lost the ship," he said calmly, "but we haven't lost each other." Simple words changed the mood of the camp. The mission to cross Antarctica was over. There would be no victory, no records, no celebration. From this moment on, every decision had only one purpose: to bring every single man home alive. The ice beneath their feet continued drifting north. The days grew slightly warmer. Small cracks began appearing across the frozen surface. It was a warning. The ice that had trapped them for months was beginning to break apart. Soon, staying on it would become more dangerous than leaving it. For the first time since abandoning Endurance, the 3 lifeboats would have to face the open sea. And beyond those freezing waters waited one of the most violent oceans on Earth. At first, the cracks were easy to ignore. Thin lines spread across the surface of the ice, disappearing beneath fresh snow. But with each passing day, they grew wider. The frozen platform that had kept the crew alive for months was slowly falling apart. Then one night, a loud crack jolted everyone awake. The ground beneath their tents shifted. Sleeping bags slid across the ice. Some men stumbled outside, only to find dark seawater flowing through a fresh opening a few meters away. Shackleton didn't wait for sunrise. Launched the boats. Within minutes, the camp came alive. The 3 lifeboats were dragged toward the water. Every crate of food, every blanket, every compass, every precious supply had to be loaded quickly. There would be no second chance. One by one, the boats touched the freezing sea. The men climbed aboard for the first time in months. They were no longer standing on solid ice. They were back on the Southern Ocean. The waves slammed against the small wooden boats without mercy. Freezing spray soaked their clothes within minutes. Hands went numb on the oars. The cold wind cut across their faces like knives. Towering icebergs drifted silently around them, forcing the boats to weave through narrow passages. One mistake, one collision, and the icy water would end everything. Hour after hour, they rode through the frozen maze. Sometimes they found open water. Sometimes they had to climb out and push the boats over thick slabs of floating ice before climbing back in again. It was exhausting, but stopping wasn't an option. Then, through the fog, someone shouted. Head turned at once. Far in the distance, A dark shape rose above the horizon. It was Elephant Island, the first solid land they had seen in nearly 16 months. A wave of relief swept through the exhausted crew, but Shackleton remained cautious. He knew reaching the island and landing safely were two very different things. Powerful waves crashed against the rocky coastline. The wind grew stronger with every passing minute. One wrong approach could smash the lifeboats against the cliffs, after everything they had survived. The final few hundred meters could still take their lives. The men tightened their grip on the oars ahead of them. The sea prepared one last brutal test. The waves refused to let them through. Every time the lifeboats moved closer to the shore, another wall of water threw them back into the open sea. The men had survived months on drifting ice. It would be cruel to lose everything within sight of land. Shackleton stood at the bow, watching the rhythm of the waves. He waited, then shouted, "Row." Now every man pulled with everything he had left. The boat surged forward. A powerful wave lifted them high above the water and carried them toward the rocky beach. The next second, the hull slammed against the shore. Before another wave could drag them back, the crew jumped into the freezing surf and pulled the boats onto land with their bare hands. Then, silence. One by one, the men collapsed onto the stones. Some kissed the ground. Others simply lay there, staring at the sky. For the first time in 497 days, they were standing on solid land. It felt like a miracle, but the feeling didn't last long. As Shackleton explored the coastline, reality became painfully clear. Elephant Island was completely deserted. No houses, no harbor, no rescue station. Not even a single sign that another human had ever been there. It was nothing more than a lonely rock surrounded by one of the most dangerous oceans on Earth. The food they had brought wouldn't last forever. Winter was slowly returning, and no ship had any reason to sail anywhere near this island. Waiting for rescue wasn't a plan, it was a death sentence. That evening, Shackleton spread a weathered map across the rocks. His officers gathered around him. There were only three possible destinations: the coast of South America, the Falkland Islands, or South Georgia Island. The first two looked closer, but violent winds and powerful currents would push any small boat far off course. South Georgia was different. It was farther away, nearly 1,300 kilometers across the wild Southern Ocean. But if they could reach it, there was a whaling station, real people, real ships, a chance to save everyone. The problem was almost impossible to believe. To reach South Georgia, they would have to cross the Drake Passage, a stretch of ocean feared by even the most experienced sailors, waves as tall as buildings, hurricane-force winds, freezing water capable of killing a man within minutes, no modern navigation. No engine powerful enough to fight the storms, only a small wooden lifeboat. And hope. Shackleton looked at his exhausted crew. He already knew what had to be done. The question wasn't whether the journey was dangerous. The question was, who would be brave enough to sail into it? That night, almost no one slept. The wind howled across Elephant Island, rattling the makeshift shelter the crew had built from overturned lifeboats. Everyone understood the situation. If they stayed where they were, they would eventually run out of food. If they sailed into the Southern Ocean, they might never be seen again. At sunrise, Shackleton made his decision. He would leave Elephant Island not to save himself, but to bring help back for every man waiting on that lonely shore. He chose 5 companions for the journey, not because they were the strongest, but because he trusted them when everything depended on experience, discipline, and courage. The strongest of the 3 lifeboats was selected. Its name was James Caird. Compared to the ocean they were about to face, it looked unbelievably small, just over 7 meters long. Hardly the kind of boat anyone would choose for one of the most dangerous sea voyages in history. Before leaving, the ship's carpenter worked day and night to strengthen the little boat. Extra wooden planks were added. The seams were sealed as tightly as possible. A simple canvas cover was stretched across the top to keep at least some of the freezing water out. It wasn't perfect. It simply had to be good enough. Shackleton walked through the camp one final time. He spoke quietly with every man who would remain behind. No dramatic speeches, no false promises, only one simple sentence: come back. The men staying on Elephant Island. Those words became their only hope. On the morning of April 24, 1916, the James Caird was pushed into the freezing surf. Massive waves immediately lifted the tiny boat like a leaf. The 6 men climbed aboard. Those on the beach watched in complete silence. No one waved, no one shouted, they simply stood there, until the little boat disappeared into the mist. Ahead lay nearly 1,300 kilometers of open ocean, no rescue ships, no satellite navigation, no weather forecasts, only a compass, a sextant, and one navigator who had to calculate their position whenever the clouds briefly revealed the sun. A single mistake could send them hundreds of kilometers off course. And in the Southern Ocean, that mistake would almost certainly be fatal. As darkness fell on the first day, enormous waves surrounded the James Caird. The little boat climbed one mountain of water, only to plunge into the next. Freezing spray crashed over the deck again and again. Within hours, every man was soaked to the bone. Ice began forming on their clothes, on the ropes, even along the sides of the boat. If too much ice accumulated, the extra weight could pull them beneath the waves. Every few hours, the crew hacked the ice away with axes and bare hands before it became too heavy. The journey had barely begun, already. The Southern Ocean was trying to claim them. By the third day, time had lost all meaning. The sun appeared only for a few brief moments before disappearing behind thick clouds again. Without a clear view of the sky, their navigator had almost no way to confirm their position. The James Caird was now completely surrounded by open ocean. No land, no passing ships. Only endless gray water stretching to the horizon. The storms grew worse with every passing hour. Towering waves rose beneath the tiny lifeboat, lifting it high into the air before dropping it into deep valleys of water. Each impact felt as if the boat would split apart. The men barely spoke anymore. Every ounce of energy was spent keeping the boat alive. One man steered. Another bailaed out freezing water. The rest fought to keep the boat balanced as violent waves crashed over the deck. Nobody stayed dry. Nobody stayed warm. Salt water soaked their clothes day and night. The freezing wind stole whatever body heat they had left. Sleep came in short, painful moments, sometimes no more than a few minutes before another wave slammed into the boat. Then came the greatest challenge of the journey. A massive storm swept across the Southern Ocean without warning. The sky turned almost black. The wind screamed through the rigging. Suddenly, a giant wave appeared out of the darkness. It rose higher and higher, until it blocked out the horizon. For a split second, everyone believed it was over. The James Caird climbed the face of the wave at an impossible angle. The boat reached the top, then plunged straight down the other side. Water exploded across the deck. The little lifeboat disappeared beneath the foam for several terrifying seconds. Nothing could be seen then. Against all odds, it surfaced, still floating, still moving. The men looked at one another. No one smiled. They simply returned to work. There would be time for relief only after they reached land. Days later, the storm finally weakened. The clouds broke apart just long enough for the navigator to raise his sextant toward the sun. He checked the calculations once, then again. He could hardly believe the result. Against every probability, they were still on course. Shackleton stared toward the empty horizon. Somewhere ahead, hidden beyond the mist, South Georgia Island had to be there. But another danger remained. Even if they found the island, its coastline was surrounded by towering cliffs, and violent surf reaching land would become one final battle against the sea. On the morning of the 16th day, a dark shape finally appeared through the fog. First, no one was certain if it was real. After days of staring at nothing but waves, the mind could easily play tricks. But as the clouds slowly drifted apart, the outline became clearer. Towering mountains, snow-covered peaks. It was South Georgia Island. For the first time in over 2 weeks, the 6 exhausted men allowed themselves to believe they might actually survive. But Antarctica wasn't finished with them yet. As the James Caird approached the island, hurricane-force winds slammed into the tiny lifeboat. Gigantic waves exploded against the rocky cliffs, making any landing impossible. For nearly 24 hours, they were forced to remain offshore, battling the sea while exhaustion pushed every man to his limit. One wrong wave, one broken oar, and the entire journey would end only a few hundred meters from safety. Finally, the weather eased just enough. Shackleton spotted a small opening between the rocks. Now, the crew pulled with every bit of strength they had left. The lifeboat surged forward. A powerful wave carried them through the narrow gap, and moments later the keel scraped against solid ground. After 16 days and nearly 1,300 kilometers across one of the world's most dangerous oceans, they had made it. But there was one final obstacle. The whaling station wasn't on this side of the island. It was on the opposite coast. Between them stood towering mountains, glaciers, and terrain that no one had ever crossed. Waiting for another boat wasn't an option. So Shackleton made one last impossible decision. Leaving the weakest men behind with shelter and supplies, he chose 2 companions and began climbing into the frozen mountains. For more than 36 exhausting hours, the 3 men crossed razor-sharp ridges, icy slopes, and deep valleys without proper climbing equipment. There were moments when they couldn't risk stopping if they fell asleep in the freezing cold. They would never wake up. At one point, they reached a steep, snow-covered slope. There was no safe way down. Shackleton looked at his companions without another word. The 3 men locked arms and slid down the mountain together, trusting gravity more than fear. Minutes later, they reached the valley below. As dawn broke, a strange sound echoed through the silence. A steam whistle, the whaling station. For the first time in almost a year and a half, they had reached civilization. The workers couldn't believe what they were seeing. The men standing before them looked almost unrecognizable. Their clothes were torn, their faces were covered with thick beards, they were thin, exhausted, and barely able to stand. Yet somehow, they were alive. But Shackleton refused to celebrate. 22 of his men were still stranded on Elephant Island. He immediately organized rescue attempts. The first failed, then the second. Even the 3rd rescue ship was turned back by heavy sea ice. Most people would have accepted defeat. Shackleton never did. On August 30, 1916, more than 4 months after leaving Elephant Island, his 4th rescue ship finally broke through the ice. As the ship approached the shore, the stranded crew rushed toward the beach. Some couldn't believe what they were seeing. Their commander had kept his promise. Shackleton stepped onto the deck and looked toward the island. His first question wasn't about the expedition. It wasn't about the ship. It wasn't about the world. He asked only one thing. "Are you all well?" The reply came back instantly. All safe, all alive. Against every prediction, against the frozen sea, against impossible odds, every single member of the Endurance expedition had survived. They never crossed Antarctica. They never completed the mission they had set out to achieve. But they accomplished something far greater. They proved that true leadership isn't measured by reaching a destination. It's measured by bringing your people home, and more than a century later. The story of endurance is remembered not as a tale of failure, but as one of the greatest survival stories ever lived.